Hello and welcome back to the workshop. It's today's weather report is it's not raining at all, so we won't be bothered with the rain battering off the roof today. The last three videos have been quite heavy going, talking about statistics and mathematics, but we've shown that to all intents and purposes the coronavirus epidemic in Britain finished sometime in June, and all we have left is a wee bit of a few remnants of the virus, which have now fallen into the background, the epidemiological background, and will be there forevermore. There is no epidemic anymore. So we'll do something a wee bit more fun today. We're going to look at some legislation. In particular, we're going to look at the Coronavirus, open brackets, Scotland, close brackets, Act 2020. I make quite a good living as an IT consultant, a freelance consultant, selling my services out to big companies and government departments. A lot of the time when I'm doing that, I'm selling my services as a test manager, which means that I have to ensure that the testing for new software and services has been carried out as efficiently as possible. That in turn means that I have to spend a lot of time reading specifications, because very often they're not very good. And by reading specifications carefully and understanding the meaning behind them and having them changed where necessary, I can save companies a huge amount of money by doing the minimum amount of work, and the minimum amount of work is a quantity I rather specialise in. So, back to the Coronavirus Scotland Act 2020. There's 70 pages of this Act, which seems to be quite a lot, but in fact it's only, as far as I can see, it's a subset of the Coronavirus Act 2020, which is a UK Parliament Act, which is a whopping 342 pages. So think yourselves lucky I'm not doing that one. Just in case the 70 pages of this isn't enough, there is also the Coronavirus, open brackets, Scotland, close brackets, open brackets, number 2, close brackets, Act 2020, which adds another 45 pages, trying to explain the 70 pages in the first one. There may be a Coronavirus Act number 3, I haven't found it yet, it'll probably come up at some point. But this legislation is an act of the Scottish Parliament, a parliament that we in Scotland spent the best part of 300 years trying to get back after the Act of Union, so it deserves a bit of respect. So there will now be a short break while I change into the ceremonial uniform of the Member of Scottish Parliament. That's better. Now I'm properly attired, we'll continue. As I said, there are 70 pages in this Act, although we're not going to read them all. I'll just summarise for you. I'll go through the articles, the sections in turn, and explain what they are. Section 1 is the meaning of coronavirus, which is a very sensible place to start. Rather more sensible than I expected. And it defines exactly what they mean by coronavirus. And it says, in this Act, coronavirus means severe acute respiratory syndrome, coronavirus 2, SARS-CoV-2. And that's a very sensible thing to do, because there are several coronaviruses in several different groups. So it makes sense to define exactly which one we're talking about. If they hadn't done that, the next time the common cold came up, they could just use this Act to apply all of the restrictions again without any further ado. So there we are. That sets out what is possibly the most important piece of legislation for health in my lifetime in this country. So Section 2 deals with eviction from dwelling houses. Section 3 is the temporary extensions and moratoriums on diligence. Section 4 is about children and vulnerable adults. Section 5 is about justice. Section 6, alcohol licensing. 7 is functioning of public bodies. And Section 8 is other measures in response to coronavirus. Now, none of that really has very much to do with health. And in fact, we'll find this again as we carry through the second part. That was part 1 of the Act. Part 2 is the remaining articles, and it's number 9 is the advancement of equality and non-discrimination. Number 10 is the subordinate legislation making powers. The 11 is the power to suspend and revive provisions. Number 12 is the expiry, which says when this Act expires. Number 13 is the power to bring forward the expiry, which basically changes part 12. Part 14 is power to amend the Act in consequence of amendments to subordinate legislation, which just means they're going to change this Act when other stuff changes. 15 is reports. It says what reports the Scottish ministers have to provide on the status of the provision provided by this Act. Article 16 is ancillary provision, which basically seems to be very similar to Part 10 and 8 and possibly 11. Section 17 says when the Act comes into force, and it's just the day after royal assent, the day after the Queen says it does. And Section 18 is the short title of the Act, and the short title of this Act is the Coronavirus, open brackets, Scotland, close brackets, Act 2020, which is, I think, exactly the same. As long titles, that would appear to be a bit of a waste of a section, but I imagine that lawyers would be quite happy with that. So there you are, the very briefest of run-throughs of what is quite possibly the most important piece of legislation in Scotland for the past, well, this century, probably. So I'm going to have to take this off. How do they sit with those things on all day in the Parliament? I do not know. I've got some respect for them there. Now what we've got here are parts 1 to 8 are described within this document here, and they contain almost no useful information in themselves at all. They are not intended for the likes of you and I to read. They are intended for lawyers, because they're nearly all references to other laws, other regulations that will be altered as a result of this legislation. So there's almost nothing in this of any importance to everyday life. There's nothing that says how far away you have to stand from anybody else, how often you wash your hands, which song you sing while you're doing that, what kind of mask, face covering or other obscuring material you have to use. Nothing. Whether you can have a pint on a Friday. None of that's here. That's because it's been delegated. It's been delegated to the Scottish ministers by right of Section 10 here, which is a subordinate legislation making powers. Any power to make subordinate legislation conferred by virtue of Part 1 includes the power to make incidental, supplementary, consequential, transitional, transitory or saving provision and different provision for different purposes or areas. Now, basically what that means is that the Scottish ministers have been given pretty much carte blanche to do what they want without recourse to Parliament. I really have to think though. I can understand why they've done this. It means that Parliament, all those very busy people in Holyrood, will not have to read this stuff. And to be honest, I suspect a lot of them haven't read this at all. They've just voted it, as they do in most things, is voting party lines. But it means that they won't have to come back to Holyrood again to vote on another lot of nonsense. And they'll just devolve the power, or delegate the power, to the Scottish ministers. I would have thought any student of 20th century history should have been very wary of any legislation which enables ministers to make decisions on their own without recourse to Parliament in time of a supposed emergency. I rather suspect that many of them haven't quite understood what the possibilities are, especially if the government of the day were to turn out to be overly authoritarian. Well, there you go. That didn't take long at all. That's a quick run through the Coronavirus Scotland Act 2020. And I mentioned the fact that it doesn't say anything about the various health preventative measures which are currently in place, about shutting bookshops and pubs because they're obviously hotspots for virus, about making people wear masks on buses or any of that stuff. That is not the omission that I mentioned right at the start. That is not what I think is missing from this Act. What is missing from this Act, and it's a thing which would cause me as a test manager to send something like this back to the originator for checking and amendment, is the fact that nowhere in this document, nowhere in these 70 pages does it actually say what it is they're trying to do. What it does is tell us how they're going to try and do what it is they're trying to do. But what are they trying to do? Are they trying to eliminate the virus, which is obviously a hopeless task? Are they trying to reduce the demand so that the peak of medical demand is within the capacity? We saw in the last video, we explained why the squash the sombrero phrase came about. So that is what I think is really, really missing. They're doing all of this stuff, they haven't explained why. If they have, I've missed it. But I would have thought that in as one act, which is specifically designed to counteract what people keep telling us is a horrible illness, and which we know isn't, and is past anyway. Why? That's just a ridiculous omission. And that's the most that we're going to learn from the Coronavirus Act Scotland 2020, which is not very much at all, really, because all the important bits are kept in another bit of legislation, which we will come to later. In fact, it's the Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions and Requirements Scotland Regulations 2020, which is even more a barrel of laughs than this one was. But it is an act in my Parliament, so we will need to give it the due that is deserved. It deserves. So I will once again adopt the uniform of the MSP, and we will play out from this video to the strains of the Scottish Parliament anthem.